Our topic is the Crimean Tatars, and in particular the Crimean Khanate. I ended our last lecture with reference to the phenomenon of the Cossacks. I have ended it a couple times, and as we are going to see, the Cossack phenomenon is related to the history of the steppe, But before we can understand how the Cossacks came into being, first we have to consider developments in this wider region of what is today southern Ukraine and lands east of the Sea of Azov and Caspian Sea. So this area here and still farther east, as you can see on the map that I have just handed out. Now, traditional historiography about Ukraine has considered the mid-14th to mid-17th century, which is the era that we have been looking at, roughly from the mid-1300s, and now extending it to the mid-17th century. This traditionally is looked at and considered the Lithuanian and Polish, or the Polish-Lithuanian era, and we certainly have been looking at that. Of course, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, the Kingdom of Poland, ruled significant parts of present-day Ukrainian territory and had a profound impact on political, socioeconomic, cultural developments on Ukraine and its inhabitants. But there is a third entity, the Crimean Khanate. The Crimean Khanate and during this very same period, it actually ruled at least a quarter of Ukraine, according to present-day borders, and which also had a long-standing impact on developments in other Ukrainian territories, even beyond its direct control. And it's for that reason that we should be referring here to the Lithuanian-Polish-Crimean period in the history of Ukraine. The Lithuanian-Polish-Crimean period. We last spoke of the Crimean Peninsula and the steppe zone immediately north of the Black Sea when we were looking at the 14th century. And this was a time when the Golden Horde, also known as the Kipchak Khanate, spelt also in this manner, Kipchak Khanate, of which Crimea was a part, had this Golden Horde given a large degree of autonomy or independence to Genoese merchants, that is, merchants from Genoa, who, as a result, came to dominate the trade and commerce that was flowing through Crimea, and in particular, the city of Caffe on the Black Sea coast, through there to other Italianate Crimean black ports along the Black Sea, and then from there to the Mediterranean and what we now know as Italy. But during the second half of the 14th century, the late 1300s, this Golden Horde entered an extended period of internal and political crisis, foreign invasions, among others, by the Lithuanians from the north. Remember, the Lithuanians were the first to defeat the Golden Horde in a battle in the 14th century. And the result was that by this 1400s, this once powerful Mongolo-Tatar state, the Golden Horde, the Kipchak Khanate, was in the throes of disintegration. And in its stead, Tatar tribesmen established 3 new states known as Khanates, and those are indicated on this map, very rare map that shows actually all 3 of them. As you can see, then 2 of them came into existence in the 1440s in the peripheral regions of the Golden Horde. That was the Kazan Khanate in the north, the Crimean Khanate to the west. The third of those 3, the Astrakhan Khanate, was still based in the territory, or took over the main territory of the Golden Horde along the Volga River, lower Volga River, in 1502. Because it was, I used the year 1502 because it was in that year that the Golden Horde literally then ceased to exist as a distinct political entity. And the core of its territory taken over by the Astrakhan Khanate and these other 2 Khanates nearby, as you can see. Each of these successor Khanates to the Golden Horde, Kazan, Crimea, Astrakhan, continued the Mongol practice, extracting tribute from those states that had formerly been part of Kievan Rus. In this case, the Kazan Khanate and the Astrakhan Khanates received payments from Muscovy. The Crimean Khanate also from Muscovy, but in particular from Lithuania and Poland. These 3, if you will, Tatar successor states were formidable powers in their own right. And as a result of that, much of the early history of both the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and later the Grand Duchy of Muscovy was marked by efforts to rid themselves of what was considered, from their perspective, the odious and humiliating heritage of the Golden Horde's Tatar yoke, as was now being maintained by those successor states, the Kazan, Astrakhan, and Crimean Khanates. It was the Crimean Khanate of these 3 that had the most direct bearing on the lands of present-day Ukraine. Already, while the Golden Horde was still an existing political force, the Crimea became a refuge for those princes of the ruling dynasty of the Golden Horde. Some of them tried to become the supreme leader of the Golden Horde, and when they failed, they left somewhere. And where did they go? Crimea was a kind of refuge for these people that were no longer in favor with the ruling princes of the Golden Horde, or the Khans. One of these exiled leaders was a man named Hacı I Giray. Now, he was a Chinggisid prince. What does that mean, a Chinggisid prince? Well, it meant that he was a descendant of none other than the great Khan, the Chinggis Khan, the very creator of the Mongol Empire. This Hacı I Giray was invited by local Tatar clan leaders, also from the Golden Horde, to rule the Crimea. He arrived sometime in the 1430s, and he proclaimed the independence of Crimea from the Golden Horde. Complicated struggle ensued against varying political forces on the peninsula, but he managed to become the first Khan of the Crimean Khanate, and he ruled from about 1441 to 1466, and thereby establishing the Giray dynasty. The Giray dynasty. 66. In the course of their rise to power, it was inevitable that the Crimean Khans of this Giray family would clash with, first they would clash with the rules of the Golden Horde, because the Golden Horde was still existing, it still claimed territory over Crimea. It also would clash with two other forces within the peninsula, small peninsula, very complex, but it had two other forces. And what were those two other forces? One of them was called the Theodoro-Mangup Principality. You can see that one on your map in the southwest of the peninsula, Theodoro-Mangup, and then also the Genoese, who were in the ports along the Black Sea. So we have the Golden Horde, the Theodoro-Mangup Principality, the Genoese, and in the midst of this three-way struggle for control of Crimea between now the Giray family, the Theodoro princes, the Genoese, a new contender enters the field. These were the Ottoman Turks, the Ottoman Empire. Now, following the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the end of the East Roman Empire, the end of Byzantium, taken over now by the Ottoman Empire, the conqueror of the city in 1453, Sultan Mehmed I, was determined to extend his realm not only the Black Sea, but north of the Black Sea, and that would allow him to transform, as was perceived in the Ottoman world, that the Black Sea would become just simply an Ottoman lake, controlled on all sides, certainly the south, the heart of the empire, but also the northern shores as well. And as a result of that situation, goal, in 1475, the Ottoman forces arrived in Crimea. They captured the city of Caffe, other Black Sea ports. They also captured that mountaintop fortress of Mangup in the Theodoro-Mangup Principality, destroying, therefore, that principality. And at the same time, the Sultan rejected the Crimean Khan's claim for Caffe and the Black Sea coastal towns, which are now placed directly under Ottoman rule, as you can see now on this second map, and also on the map here on the board with these red lines. So the whole southern, from 1475, all of the coastal portion of the Crimea Peninsula is directly ruled by the Ottoman Empire, and kind of symbolically, all of those old Byzantine Greek towns with Greek names, then they had all these Italianate names, and now they get Turkish names. And so we have Moncastro in the Far East, Far West, in the, where the Dniester River flows into the Black Sea. Moncastro becomes Ak-Kerman, or later Ackerman. Kerkio becomes Kerch. Tana, Azak on the Sea of Azov. Cembalo, Baliklava. Soldaya, Sudak. And the most important of all, Kaffa, the great Genoese emporium, now becomes Caffe. Turkish Caffe, by the way, it's modern-day Feodosia, a port on the Black Sea coast of Crimea. Now, this arrival of the Ottomans prompted a new realignment of political power in Crimea. The Sultan, he claimed that he was the political heir of the Golden Horde, and backed by overwhelming military force, in effect, he was able to dictate his terms to the Giray rulers of Crimea. They reached an accommodation in return for pledging vassalage to the Sultan. The ruling Khan at the time, Megley I Giray, with Ottoman military support, was able to regain the Crimean throne, which he was removed from for a while. He was able to impose his authority vis-a-vis rivals within the region. And so now we have a situation in which this Crimean peninsula is divided, narrow strip of non-contiguous territory on the Black Sea, directly under the rule of the Ottomans, the rest of the peninsula under the authority of the Crimean Khan of the Giray family, as well as clan leaders loyal to him. Very important, it's going to have implications for international relations and their impact on Ukraine. From the very beginning, the Ottomans maintained a special relationship with the Crimean Khanate and its ruling Giray dynasty. Well, what was that special relationship? The Ottoman Sultan claimed authority over all the Turkic peoples that inhabited the steppe region stretching far eastward into Central Asia. Since the Girays were direct descendants of the Genghis Khan, they were Chinggisids, the Ottomans used their connection, that is the connection of the Girays with the Crimean Khanate, to legitimize their own claims over the Central Asiatic Turkic world. So again, the Girays, they're the direct descendants, the Ottomans control them, and so then somehow that gives them the authority for all of the Turkic peoples in Central Asia. So for example, in contrast to all of the other Ottoman vassal states, the Ottomans had spread control over what we now know as the Middle East, eventually the entire Balkan peninsula, almost as far as Vienna, by the way, and certainly Hungary. And in all those cases, those vassal states that they set up, they had to pay tribute and also supply troops to the Sultan. So this is how the Ottoman Empire maintained its control. But in the case of Crimea, it was the Sultan who provided the Crimean Khans with an annual pension and with land holdings in the central Turkish Ottoman provinces of Rumelia and Anatolia. And whenever the Ottomans needed troops from Crimea, they sent an invitation. It wasn't a demand, it was an invitation, formal, not an order, for the Crimean Khan to contribute to the Ottomans' campaign expenses. So that's what that special relationship was. And it had to do with the Crimean contact with, or descendant from, from Genghis Khan. Now, while it is true that Ottoman interference in Crimean politics did increase, certainly from the end of the 16th century, the 1500s, nonetheless, the Crimean Khanate was able to maintain a privileged position within the Ottoman Empire and, for all intents and purposes, to follow an independent foreign policy vis-a-vis its neighbors. As I've already alluded, in 1502, the ruler of Crimea, Nogay Giray, who's actually the son of the founder, Hacı I Giray, he had successfully attacked the Golden Horde on the lower Volga River, drove out its rulers, and he then adopted for himself and his Crimean successors the title, the Great Khan of the Golden Horde and the Kipchak steppe. Mengli and those Crimean Khans who followed him also proclaimed the inheritance to the Golden Horde's right to collect tribute from Poland, Lithuania, and Muscovy. Now, claims such as these brought the Crimean Khanate into conflict with its two neighbors to the north. This was particularly the case with Muscovy, with whom the Crimean Khanate remained in conflict throughout the first half of the 16th century, arguing over who's going to control the former Golden Horde territory. And, of course, in the end, it was divided among the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, and also, as you can see on your map, this white area where it says Nogay, a tribe, another Tatar tribe, that really controlled all of that open steppe region. So what was Crimea? What was this Crimean Khanate? Well, first of all, it was a state governed by Islamic law. Its rulers and majority Tatar and Turkic population was Sunni Muslims. The head of the state was the Khan of the Giray dynasty. And, of course, we know with his preeminent status, because he and his successors, descendants of Genghis Khan. Now, these Giray Khans were not absolute rulers. Instead, they governed with the active participation of Crimean Tatar clan leaders. These leaders were known as beys. And these major clans are indicated on this second map that I handed out. As you can see, there were 6 of them: Shirin, Barin, Argin, Yashlav, the Mangit or Mansur, and the Kipchak. So here are these clans. And those clans derive their social and economic influence from 2 sources. One was the ownership of large tracts of land, mostly in the steppe portion of the peninsula, that is north of the mountains along the coast, and also because of their ability to supply or deny, at their own discretion, troops to the Crimean Khan. Now, the Tatar inhabitants of the Crimean Khanate, numbering about 500,000 in the mid-16th century, comprised a really heterogeneous population, differing quite radically depending on its origins or linguistic characteristics or geographic location. In terms of geography, the Crimean Khanate included the territory in the Crimean Peninsula itself, as well as beyond the peninsula in the steppe regions of southern Ukraine, north of the Black Sea and Sea of Azov, and also a large chunk of territory east of the Sea of Azov. The peninsula itself, geographically diverse. The northern two-thirds consisted of a steppe-like plain, more or less a continuation of the steppes of southern Ukraine. And then very close to the coast were mountains. We call them the Crimean Mountains. And a very tiny little littoral along the coast, right under the mountains, where all of these ports and cities were located. Somewhat like if you travel to the eastern part of the French Riviera or the northwestern part of the Italian Riviera, where the Alps fall into the sea, and you have these little famous towns along the coast like Monaco or Sanremo, etc. That's really what the Crimea was like as well. Now, in broadest terms, the population living in the Crimean Khanate belonged to two groups. We have nomads and sedentary population. The nomads, the nomadic elements, lived in the steppe-like plains, covering, as I just said, about two-thirds of the peninsula, but also southern Ukraine. The sedentary population inhabited the foothills and mountain valleys, and in particular, the coastal towns and villages on the northern shores of the Black Sea. Crimean Tatar ruling elite included, obviously, the extended Giray family, the Khan and all of his relatives and sons. Also, the elite, part of that elite were these various clan leaders, these beys that I just spoken about, who had administered large tracts of land in the peninsula steppe lands and mountain regions. They were descendants, all of this elite, of the Turkic Kipchak nomads and warriors who lived in the heart of the Mongol Golden Horde. These Kipchaks left over from the Polovtsians when the Mongols came and invaded in the 13th century. And then there was the majority of the population. For millennia, the Crimean Peninsula, one of the most heterogeneous regions in terms of people in all of Europe, home to numerous other peoples. Some of them we've heard in this course: Scythians, Goths, Alans, Huns, Greeks, Genoese, Armenians. Some of those were originally nomadic, others sedentary agriculturalists and town dwellers. And in the course of the 15th and 16th century, most of these groups, most, not all, became linguistically Turkicized and adopted the Muslim faith. And this heterogeneous mix of peoples came to be known as Tats. T-A-T-S. It was these Tats who were to become the dominant demographic element in the peninsula, and it was they who provided the Crimean Tatars with characteristics that made them distinct from other Tatars in Central Asia. In other words, the Tats, whether peasant farmers or artisans or tradespeople or bureaucrats, they formed the very core of the Crimean polity. Peasant villages in Crimea, peasant farmers were organized in villages. The land was worked in common. Taxes were assigned by the landlord, usually that tribal or clan leader, to the village as a whole, and then the peasants paid to the village. Important here is the peasants were not proprietary serfs. There was no neo-serfdom as there was in other parts of Central and Eastern Europe, as we saw a couple times ago. And so they were free to leave the land if they wished. Among the most important and lucrative export products of Crimean agriculture were fruits, tobacco, honey. This is a warm climate, long growing season throughout the year. Now, most of Crimea's diverse peoples assimilated to the peninsula's Turkic-speaking Islamic majority, and as that happened, those peoples left a distinct cultural and linguistic imprint on these Tats. There were also a few peoples who, while adopting Turkish speech, did not become Muslims. These included the Christian Armenians and the Christian Greeks and the Jewish Krimchaks, as they were called. So they spoke Turkish, used Turkish. For instance, the Krimchaks used still the Hebrew alphabet, but it was a Turkic language. The first capital of the Crimean Khanate was the eastern town of Solkhat, that is just beyond the mountains. But then in the 16th century, it moved farther to the center of the area to a town called Bakhchysaray. Great name, Bakhchysaray. Bakhchysaray. There, the Crimean Giray rulers, already in 1532, founded a new palace that was to become the permanent residence of the Crimean Khans. I'll pass out this one illustration to give you an idea of this Islamic Turkic world in Crimea. This is an illustration of the Khan's palace, around which were extended gardens, mosques, schools, other public buildings. In effect, this Bakhchysaray was transformed into an impressive center of Islamic culture and also the political seat of the Crimean Khanate. Now, whereas the Crimean Khanate quickly took on the characteristics of a stable sedentary society associated with agricultural, artisan, commercial pursuits of the majority of the population who were living in that southern third of the peninsula, there was yet another important element within the political sphere of the Crimean Khanate. These were those Nogay Tatars, the Nogays. These were Kipchak-speaking nomadic peoples of Turkic origin who pastured their flocks on the steppe lands north of the Caspian Sea. These Nogays were originally one of the many tribal groupings within the Golden Horde. In 1556, when Muscovy finally subdued the Astrakhan Khanate, which had the core region of the Golden Horde, a portion of the Nogays migrated westward to the steppe zone north of the Sea of Azov and Black Sea. So they moved from basically out here, east of the Volga River, to the area north of the Black Sea and Sea of Azov. These Nogay tribes, generally referred to just simply as Tatars, are the subject of much attention in the history of Ukraine. Now, theoretically, these various Nogay tribes were expected to recognize the authority of the Crimean Khan, usually in the form of a representative that the Khan sent from Bakhchysaray. But in practice, the Nogays usually followed their own whims and often rebelled against the Crimean Khanate. And yet, as one historian remarked, specifically Alan Fisher, quote, the Nogays served a useful purpose for the Crimean Khanate. Why? They prevented the establishment of solid Slavic settlements in the steppe, and they provided the Crimean slave markets with a never-ending supply of slaves. In fact, by the early 16th century, the early 1500s, the Crimean economy had come to be based largely on the slave trade. The slave trade. Now, slavery was legal according to Islamic law, but only persons from outside the Muslim world could be enslaved. So non-Muslims. And therefore, captives taken in wars against non-Muslim powers, these were the prime candidates for slavery. Now, while slaves formed an integral part of the Ottoman Empire's socioeconomic system, and that includes also the Crimean Khanate, that same system, that same society allowed for various forms of manumission, that is, freeing slaves, both for slaves and their offspring. And that led to a situation, since many of them could be freed, the empire was in constant need of replenishing slaves. And before long, the Ottomans' new vassal state, the Crimean Khanate, became the primary source of slaves. Crimea as the primary source of slaves. And so in practice, when, from the standpoint of the Crimean world and their operating, whenever there was a downturn in agricultural productivity, the Khanate, the state, could supply its income with profits earned from selling slaves. Now, just to the north of the Nogay steppe were those non-Muslim world whose inhabitants could be enslaved. And therefore, captives taken in wars against those non-Muslim powers were, in fact, the vast majority of the slaves that entered into the larger Ottoman and Crimean system. It was there that the Tatars from Crimea turned in search of Christian Slavs to enslave. Now, the Tatars, whether the cavalry of the Khan's armies or the Nogays, who we're going to see the primary slave raiders, they entered the lands of Poland, Lithuania via several invasion routes that began at a place called Perekop. I can't remember if we had this on our map exam, but it's an important place. Perekop. The Crimea is not an island, it's a peninsula, but it's attached only by a tiny little sliver of land, very important today in the war, to the mainland of Ukraine, right here. And so there was a Crimean fortress at Perekop, and it's from there that these various routes were used to raid, slave raiding routes, so to speak. The Crimean Khanate's military forces, which were almost exclusively cavalry, ranged in size from about 10 to 30,000 in the 16th century. The Nogay slave raiding parties, much smaller, but their incursions, because they were much smaller, more frequent, with the result that the number of captives that they managed to acquire was actually quite astonishing. Some scholars have estimated that on average 20,000 captives from Poland, Lithuania each year alone, with the total number of captives from the period, let's say 1500 to 1664, reaching about 1 million people. Incredible numbers. A certain number of these captives were automatically allotted to the Crimean Khan. I mean, after all, it was people under his control that organized this slave raids. The remainder were given to those who participated in a given campaign, so that was going on with regard to the Crimea, but most of them went to the Ottoman Empire. Perhaps as many as a fifth to the Sultan himself as tribute, the rest sold to Ottoman buyers at Crimean slave Tatar markets in Bakhchysaray, in another town called Karasu Bazar. And most important, slave market was the most important market city at the time, Ottoman-ruled port of Caffe on the Black Sea. Now, what happened to these captives from Ukraine when they reached the heart of the Ottoman Empire? The slaves actually functioned at all levels of Ottoman society, and as a result, their fates differed widely. At the very lowest end of the slave social scale, if you will, were galley slaves, conscripted into the Ottoman Imperial Naval Fleet. And also at that low end were field hands who labored on the landed estates of the Ottomans. House servants fared somewhat better, but there was yet another segment of captives, both male and female, who clearly improved their social and economic status while living in the Ottoman world. These people included converts to Islam, who served in various positions of the Ottoman military administrative system. And meanwhile, a certain number of females were conscripted into the harems of the Ottoman elite. The most renowned of these was a captive from the province of Galicia that we know in Ukraine, a young girl named Nastya Lisovska. She became, however, known as Roxolana, or the Hürrem in Turkish. Why do we mention her out of all of them? Well, that's because she became the favorite wife of none other than Sultan Suleiman I, Suleiman the Magnificent. And as the favorite wife, the number one, so to speak, she became a personage of political influence in her own right, and this was during the apogee of Ottoman power in Europe, that is, the mid-16th century. So literally, you could rise to the top. Now, after the mid-16th century, the mid-1500s, it was these Nogay tribes, especially one group of them called the Yedichkul, as you can see on this map, just north of the peninsula, Crimean Peninsula. It was they who were increasingly responsible for the slave raids. As for the Tatars farther south in the Crimean Peninsula, they were more interested in acting as middlemen between their Nogay suppliers in the north and their Ottoman purchasers in the south. And it is so from this period, that is the 16th and early 17th centuries, that we also have anonymous lyrical epic tales. In Ukrainian culture, they're known as dumi. They're kind of long poems sung on it with the accompanying of an instrument. These early dumis, not surprisingly, stressed only the negative aspect of captivity, as in laments of the fate of young men coerced to serve in the armies of the Ottoman Turkish infidel, as they were known or called, or of young women forced to enter harems and serve the personal needs of the Ottoman rulers. So that is the perception that one gets from these Slavic folklore, if you will, though reality could be a bit different, as I've just said. But what about the views of those who were captured? Not those who stayed behind and sung these dumi. Well, clearly not all felt that Ottoman and Crimean slavery was a fate worse than that they would endure if they never left home. It wasn't so great at home. In fact, documentary evidence about the attitude of Christian Rus captives living in Crimea and the Ottoman rule on the one hand is rare, but there are examples by contemporary chroniclers that suggest that the fate of the Rus people from Ukraine, their life in slavery in a foreign land, had its advantages, and I've alluded to some of them. And so, the Crimean Tatars and their Nogay allies really represented the most recent in a long line of nomadic and sedentary civilizations, Scythians, Sarmatians, Khazars, the Golden Horde, that came to dominate the southern steppes of Ukraine, and that continued this symbiotic relationship between the coastal cities of the Black Sea and the hinterland. Because captured slaves represented the most important resource in Crimea's economy, much of the area south of the Palatinates, the Polish Palatinates of Bratslav and Kiev, most of the area south of there, now in the open steppe, became a sparsely settled, or actually, in many ways, an entirely uninhabited no man's land known as the Wild Fields. No one wanted to live there because it was dangerous. In effect, this part of the country became what, etymologically, the name Ukraine means. That is, a borderland or a frontier. But not in the sense of the end of a civilized area, as is sometimes assumed, but rather in the sense of a buffer zone between Poland, Lithuania to the northwest, Muscovy to the northeast, and Crimea and the Ottoman Empire to the south. It is into this no man's borderland that were to come peasants and other runaway adventurers from various social strata in Polish Lithuania. And it was these runaways who formed the basis of an entirely new society, the Zaporozhian Cossacks. And it is finally to them that we will, in fact, turn after you take your break for a week or so. So see you in 2 weeks.